pretty mother's home, sweeter than the honey in the comb. Oh, my pretty mother's home, sweeter than the honey in the comb. Come, love, pretty love, come, come, come. Come, love, pretty love, I want some. Come, love, pretty love, come, love, come. Come, love, pretty love, I want some.
We can say that everything that was crafted by Shaker hands, whether it be a building or an individual tool, was created with a real precise sense of intention. Every force evolves a form. What drew me into this field was the idea of a Shaker community really as a total work of art in many ways. The Shakers really designed the landscape, the architecture, the furniture, the tools and domestic objects with a very holistic vision in mind, which was to be visions of heaven on earth.
Shakers are a Protestant sect that originated in mid-18th century England in Lancashire and Cheshire. They left the British Isles and came to North America in 1774. They were led by a charismatic woman who her followers recognized as the female embodiment of the Christ spirit returned to earth. Shakers were celibate, they were pacifist, and following their confession of sins, they organized themselves into intentional religious communities where they held all property in common. Shakerism is a very dualist faith in a way that many marginalized Christian traditions have been since the beginning of Christianity. And they essentially see the world as a fallen place, and they see man as a fallen being. And part of the goal of Shakerism is this reconciliation of the two halves of humanity, the men and women. When the pre-fall state, depending on how you interpret scripture, God, he created them in his image. The Shakers took that to mean that God is a biune being, male and female. And before the fall, Adam and Eve had both of those natures within them. And so part of the salvific mission of the Shakers is to regain that pre-fall state. And that kind of spirituality was also brought to bear on the physical environment that they created. They wanted no superfluities. They wanted simple stuff. And if they had to live in this material world, they wanted to do it with the minimum of fuss, make it purely functional, and in that way show the devotion to the spiritual mission that they were on to really get back to heaven, to restore that pre-fall state.
Fall on the rock and be broken.
There's a famous Shaker saying, do all your work as you would if you had 1,000 years to live, and as you would if you knew you must die tomorrow. And what's so remarkable about that, it's speaking to the idea of the Christian millennium. They're already saved, so they can do things to the utmost of their ability, but death isn't a concern to them.
And be broken. La, 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 la.
Things were organized very clearly, very cleanly, and often they relied on very pure forms of geometry for that organizational system. Squares, circles, these long, clean pathways to define villages, and then of course these very rigid furniture forms to even keep the body oriented in specific ways within the space when at rest. For example, the chairs that we're sitting in right now.
Father Joseph Meacham, a Baptist who was one of Mother Ann's almost immediate successors, actually grew up in a house very much like the one that we're sitting in right now, which is the Shaker Meeting House. Father Joseph prescribed that the communities in the 1790s be organized so that the buildings were parallel to each other into that central road. So it's that ordering again from the microcosm to the macrocosm, or in reverse, where everything is really rectilinear all the way through. Now, Meacham's house he grew up in probably wasn't wide open on the first floor like this one is. This is again another example of how the Shakers were different from the world around them. Their very name is a result, it's a colloquial name they were given because they manifested the spiritual through shaking and ecstatic worship, which evolved into dancing. So they had a big wide open meeting room with no Christian iconography, no posts to obstruct the dancing, but they welcomed the public in to observe the dancing and perhaps inquire about the faith.
The Shakers represent one of our earliest American vernacular forms of design. At that time, in the 18th century, design objects, whether you're talking about sort of the Pennsylvania region being very influenced by German, we see a lot of neoclassical up here in the north, it was very much based on European prototypes. Whereas the Shakers were really, I believe, one of the first examples of creating a very grassroots form and aesthetic for American design.
If you look at a building like the 1830 brick dwelling here on the campus at Hancock Shaker Village, it was designed holistically from the start. Shakers from the 18th century onward incorporated built-in case pieces, cupboards over drawers, into the buildings as they went up. This made it so that you didn't have to move a piece of furniture to clean behind it, kept things very orderly, and provided a scale of use for 4 or 5 people living in the same retiring room. Mother Ann had a saying, there is no dirt in heaven. And it is definitely clear from Shaker visitors' accounts that the Shakers strove to keep their villages neat and tidy. And by the mid-19th century, the Shaker communities were a tourist destination. We shouldn't forget that Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne actually visited this community. And the legend, if I remember right, is they had a race around the round stone barn. I kind of wonder about that, but...
Yeah, I don't know how substantiated that is, but that is the myth.
That's the myth. And non-Shakers would come to Shaker worship service, honestly, as kind of a borderline freak show experience, I think, for most of them. But they would purchase Shaker fancy goods. And these goods, which started as these functional oval boxes, by the later 19th century are lined in silk and fitted out with little sewing notions like felt needle wallets and little strawberries made of silk filled with emery that you could sharpen your needles in, wax cakes for waxing your needles. So they were marketing things really geared towards the non-Shaker worldly consumer.
So the oval box, which is of course an iconic Shaker form, although it was not by any means invented exclusively by the Shakers, was begun to be manufactured within communities for community use. So you'd see them in pantries, you'd see them in retiring rooms or bedrooms. Often they were brightly colored and they contained objects and materials for use within communities. Every aspect of Shaker design, whether it be the position and relationship of a structure to landscape or the position and structure of a piece of furniture to another or to the human body, was designed with such a sense of intention and singularity of mission and spirit.
Brings to mind the window sash in the brick dwelling. The same with the pinboard or peg rail that surrounds us even in this room. It's a Shaker recognition of the need to hang things up. And you want to do it in an orderly way. So we see historic illustrations of Shakers come to the meeting house and the women hang up their bonnets and their cloaks, and the brethren hang up their overcoats and their round hats. And you can see there's more than enough pegs here to accomplish that purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the peg rail is a great example of a very specific purpose-built form in this space, as you mentioned, for hats and coats. But then we see it in other spaces on campus, for example, the retiring rooms, and even some of the workspaces where it is more ambiguous and almost as if they're creating space for an evolution of purpose or even a spirit of experimentation, which I think also pervades Shaker design as we're looking at it over time.
We're sitting at the foot of the Shakers' holy mountain, Mount Sinai, and there's a brook that comes down. The Shakers caught the water from the brook in a large reservoir, and for most of the community's history, there was an undershot wheel here that was used to turn all kinds of woodworking equipment and laundry equipment in a shared gender facility, the laundry and machine shop, that's just to the south of us. By the late 19th century, the Shakers realized they could get a turbine, which would be far more efficient to make these machines work. So they retrofitted everything, and the brothers even installed a special adaptation for the sisters. There's a very small sliding door on a panel board wall in the sisters' laundry that they could open to reach through to turn the water on or off. They're still wanting to keep the sexes separate as much as possible, but certainly want to create an equal work environment.
The idea of rerouting entire waterways to facilitate work in these villages, the idea of that is just so astounding. And it not only powered the laundry machine shop, but also was fed to the dye house, where the Shaker sisters would dye bolt upon bolt of textile as well as skeins of yarn, many of which were spun and woven here in the village from the merino wool or flax that was harvested on site. It went underground to the dairy, where there were water-powered butter churns and also cooling areas for the butter and other dairy products to stay fresh.
Yeah, and as a design example, it's a perfect example of Shaker adaptation. Every farmer that had cows around here had a dairy barn. The Shakers had a massive herd of dairy cows, and so they sought to have the most efficient way to house them, feed them, milk them, provide a haymow for them, and collect their manure. So the building essentially functions as a machine.
In many ways, we could talk about the Shaker Village as a whole as a machine for living, for working, and for worshiping. There were many, many component parts that were built and developed and evolved over the course of the history of this village that helped it come together and become a very productive entity.
Farewell, earthly joys.
They created worlds for themselves to live and worship in. And as a result, their sense of architecture, their sense of design, which was very much inspired by their community and their beliefs in union as a community, to create this very holistic view that integrated architecture, landscape, and everyday domestic objects and tools. I don't know if that made sense.
It did until you did that.
Sorry. Whoops.
Something that is permanent, the world cannot destroy.